see me. Can someone recap what we did up until this point? Okay, let me rephrase that.
Sorry, we're like half dead right now.
Can you mute Eva? There we go. Thank you. Just on a little delay. That was me. Never mind. Sorry. You were muted. That was my bad. Why is it important to recap? So you can figure out what you do next. It's also you don't sit down and complete a whole project in a day, right? Doesn't matter how great of a developer you are. It doesn't matter if you're Mark Zuckerberg. When you have an idea in your head, you're just not going to get it done in one period of sitting down on the computer, right? And there will be times that it doesn't matter that it's 4 a.m. and that you've been up for 24 hours and you really want to get this project working. You need to take a break and step away because you start making stupid mistakes and get to the point where you go, oh my God, I missed a semicolon. I've been staring at this for 2 hours and this entire problem was just one semicolon. And when you start the project, you're just writing your code and going about it and catching those things really quickly. But it is very possible to be coding for so long that you lose track of you're not doing well. You're not at 100%. So it's very important to do that. I've been so invested in projects before that I've actually fallen asleep at my laptop or at a whiteboard. And it just gets to the point where you're like, you're so motivated on a project, you lose track of what you're working on. There are also times that you will be in a 9-to-5 work environment and 5 o'clock will roll around and you have to go. You have to get back home. You have some other thing to do. And the most helpful thing is just leave a note of where you were at. And ideally, you can leave that right in your code. So whatever line you were working on, just do a quick comment and type out a quick paragraph. Hey, future self, this is where I'm at. This is what I got done. This is what I think is next. Great. Now, when you come in the morning, you're going to be looking at your code and being like, who the hell wrote this? Right? And then you see the comment and you went, oh, thanks, past self. And you get to dive right in. So it's very important. We didn't have a chance. I don't think anyone covered project management or Scrum or Agile or any of those techniques. But there is, that's something that's ongoing. And that's actually a question that Jesse had for Seth, which like, hey, we're at this point where we have this system in place. Where do we go from here? Is it worth changing? What are the other tools? And that's a pretty common conversation that happens. And the answer, just like, should I learn another programming language, is it depends. It depends what the team is already using. It depends what the team structure is, whether your team members like what you're using, all of that kind of stuff. But the reason I'm bringing that up is what we do is we do a morning stand-up. And I think we tried to do it a little bit for the capstone demos, which is, what did you do yesterday or since your last stand-up? What are you doing today? And do you have any roadblocks? And the whole point of that is you're just giving a quick check-in on your team. But I like to write my stand-up out the night before, because we do stand-up every morning. And then that gives me a chance in the morning to have an hour to kind of collect my thoughts, figure out what I'm supposed to be doing for the rest of the day. And when we go do stand-up, I go, okay, yesterday I already wrote that out. Thank you. Because otherwise, if I did that, I would be like, I know what feature I worked on. I feel like I did 40 other things yesterday, but I don't remember what those 40 things are. So it's great to write that out. It's also great to see where you're going. So with all of that said, with the exercise we did with Seth in the beginning of class, right, it was all about iteration, right? Coincidentally, everything we have done this week has been iteration, right? So it's important not just to say, hey, we had a login form and we got that working. Let's rewind it all the way back until Monday. We set up a project from scratch. We got a front end up and running. We got our back end server. We installed a bunch of packages, all from scratch. We used documentation. We got it connected to SQLize. And SQLize, we got the server up and running. And then from there, we built out a front end. And you know what? Front end doesn't look great, but it also doesn't look horrible. All right, and we reinforced our knowledge on React Strap and using Bootstrap. Okay, well, what else did we do? Okay, well, we not only built a login system, but then we learned about hashing. And we made it so when we created an account, it hashed the password. And then we saw the problems with using MD5, and so we added in Salt. And then from there, we scrapped all of that code, which is not just the side effect of learning this. I delete code all the time. I actually today celebrated deleting 500 lines of code. And why did I celebrate deleting those 500 lines? Because I replaced it with 25 lines, right? And that is, it's a tremendous feeling to go, this was great, it worked when I wrote it, but now I'm coming back to it, and whether it's a week later or a year later, I get to look at this and go, I know a more efficient way of doing this. Or I wrote this one time and then thought that was the only time I would be using it and ended up using it in 10 other places and copied and paste and copy and paste. And then all of a sudden I started to need to update it. So I only updated the last 2 or 3 of them. And then I'm having all of these repercussions, right? So refactoring, very important part of your code. To go back through and go, how can I make this better? So we looked at MD5 and we looked at salting, and that was good, but then we ripped all of that out and put in bcrypt. And we put in bcrypt because bcrypt, 1, has salting built in, and 2, uses a much more secure hashing algorithm. Okay, yeah.
So I was thinking, when they give you a random password generator, is
Yep.
that just a hash?
Random strings, it could be a hash. A hash requires an input to have an output. So in order to hash something, or in order to get a hash, you have to have a unencrypted password to put in.
It just seems like that's what they think, you know, those long strings are just random.
Yeah, so the difference is, like, if we look in our database, that hash that comes out, it looks random, but it's not. Because we're comparing it to the input. So normally when you do a password generator, it is truly a random string generator. If I can find the video, I will post it. There's no such thing as truly random in a computer. And so Cloudflare, which we covered back in the DNS days, wanted to build a secure random generator. And all the ones that existed out there weren't random enough for them. So they built a wall of lava lamps, and they put 100 lava lamps up on the wall and put a web camera up there that detected where the bubbles were in the lava lamp. And because the way the wax heats up and the way the heat comes from the bottom of the lava lamp, it was considered pretty random whether you're going to get a big bubble or a small bubble. And so they set up 3 of them across the world, 3 of them in different locations, and combined all the different lava lamps to generate random things based off of where the wax was in the lamp. So really cool ways of generating random things. And that's one of those tangents that you can go down and say, what's a creative way to create something random? But for the encryption we're using, bcrypt is not random. The salt we generated, however, is random. And we just use that create crypto string or create random crypto or whatever it was called. But there are a gazillion ways to get something random, but a hash isn't truly random. A hash is not random because there's always a correlation. Whatever you put in is going to be the same thing every time. If you put the same thing in, you get the same thing out. Correct, and why we use salt on top of that. Okay, so almost 7 o'clock, we're gonna dive in here. The last thing we are going to do on our code, on this code in particular, is we are going to use cookies. And so what happens is every time, actually, we're going to do a stepping stone in between that. First, I have to get my computer or my servers fired up. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to blow up my screen. My terminal is going to drop me into my off day. So I'm going to CD to my backend, and I'm going to be smart this time and make sure my Postgres app is on before I start my backend server. So I'm going to hit start. I'm going to npm start. And again, the reason why I can now npm start in my backend is because in my backend package.json, in scripts, we said start is equal to nodemon. So whenever we run npm start, all it's doing is running nodemon for us. So we're going to npm start. Okay, that fires up. I'm going to open up a new terminal, and we are going to cd to our front end code, and we are going to npm start there. And that's going to pop open our interface. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to create a button that will only show some information if I'm logged in. Okay, so again, this is just a hypothetical. We're not building an actual user interface you can just copy and paste right into your capstone, but we are going to create a button that just says you're logged in or you're not logged in. Okay, so I'm gonna hop over to my front end code. In my app.jsx, I'm going to come down to the very end of it, and I'm going to create a new row. And it's best practice whenever you start a row to put a column in it, even if that's going to be the only column in the row. It's not considered good practice to have a column without a row or a row without a column. So I'm going to create a button. And we are going to have that button say, am I logged in? And when we click on that button, we are going to this.check login. Okay. And I'm going to scroll up here, and I'm going to create a new function that says check login. And what are we going to do with check login? We're just going to console log hi. And the reason we're going to do that is before we get too far, we want to make sure that our button is showing up and that our on click is connected properly. So I'm going to drop down here. I'm going to say, am I logged in? And I see hi. Okay, great. That kind of looks bad to me. The two buttons are right on top of each other. So I'm just going to pop down here and put a little margin on top of that. Okay. Now, let's make that do something. Well, how do we check to see if we're logged in or not? We need to go to the server and we need to do something, right? So let's say we want to add two numbers together, right? So what we're going to do is, first of all, we need to fetch. We need to do something in the back end. So I'm going to copy and paste most of my code in. And I'm going to say, we're going to make a new thing called add, right? And add is going to take num1, which is going to be 1, and it's going to take num2, which is going to be 2. Okay, great. Then it's going to return some data from the server. We're going to parse that JSON out, and we are going to say this.setState result is equal to data.result. Okay, now we need to show that somewhere in the interface, right? So we're going to drop down here, and right underneath our button, we're going to do a new p tag, and that p tag is going to show this.state.result. Okay, I'm going to save it. I'm going to jump back here. I'm going to see my am I logged in button, and I'm going to click it, and we get a bunch of errors. And the first one, it's easy to look at the bottom because that's one that's at the bottom. But with stack traces, 9 times out of 10, we want to start at the top one. The top one that we have here is that it cannot find at. Why not? Right, we have to tell our server, hey, you should add these two numbers together. So before we make it secure, what we are going to do is just make add work, right? We want to make sure that the full front end, back end thing is working before we get fancy in our back end. So we are going to post to add, and we are going to res, and we are going to res.send. Our result is going to be what? Some, but how do we get the numbers?
Yeah.
Rec.body. And rec.body.what? I'm going to jump to my front end, and I'm going to look at the fetch requests that I had, and that's num1 and num2. So we are going to, result is going to be rec.body.num1, rec.body.num2, and just add those two together. Okay? Jump to our front end. We are going to refresh just to clear everything out. If I hit am I logged in, 3 appears. Okay, great. But am I logged in? Have I logged in yet? I don't think so, right? So what we are going to do is we are going to create what is called a middleware. And the middleware is basically a function that runs before your last function. So Express comes in, and we're actually already using a couple middlewares, and we didn't even think that they were middlewares. Does anyone know what middleware we're using? We are using body parser. Very good. Yeah, so up here, we require our body parser just like anything else. But when we say app.use, we're basically saying on every single endpoint that comes into our Express server, try and parse out the JSON before we get access to it. So the reason why we can use rec.body is because body parser is running before our endpoint and creating rec.body for us to use. The other one we are using is cores. So we're basically saying any endpoint that gets hit on our server, I could care less about cores. Anyone can access us. So we are actually already using two of our own, two middlewares that were already created for us. So we're going to jump down here, and we are going to define our own middleware. Well, we are going to say const login checker, and that is going to equal, it's an Express thing, so what do you think it's going to equal? Rec and res. And we're going to add one more in there just to be fun, one called next. And what we are going to do is we are going to go up to our login code that we had up here, our bcrypt, and we're going to steal all of this code just for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to post that into our login checker. So our login checker, because we have an await, because we're doing something with the database, we now need to make this async. Okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to find the username that was posted up in the body. And if the user doesn't exist, we're going to res.send can't sign in like always. I'm going to get a little fancy here, and I'm going to add a status 401, which is just going to say to the browser, hey, something went wrong. Okay, else we are going to try and do a match, and we're going to try and compare the salted hashed password that we have in the database with the password that was uploaded. And if there is a match, instead of sending back res.send message user signed in, instead we're going to say next. Else, still send an error back. And what that next is going to do is saying login checker is done here. I'm finished. So go ahead and call the next thing in the stack. Now our stack could have another middleware after it, but we are going to wedge in our login checker between body parser and cores, and the last thing that runs, which is going to be our add code. Okay, and how do we wedge it in there? We are going to stick it right, I called it login checker. We are going to stick it right there. And so what add's going to do is it's going to hit add, and it's going to go, before I get to login checker, let me run the global things. Let me go run cores. Let me go run body parser. And so body parser goes, okay, I'm done. Body parser itself calls next. And so Express goes, great, login checker is up. I'm going to give you rec res and next. Okay, awesome. Login checker is going to run, and if it can't find the user, or if the password doesn't match, it's going to send back the error to the end user. I'll throw my status 401 because we're being fancy, and it's going to be done. And Express is going to say, I sent something back, I'm all finished. But if the password does match, we're going to call the next thing. Okay, well, what's the next thing? Oh, the next thing is adding two numbers together. Okay, so I'm going to save this code. I'm going to go to my browser. Any questions on middleware? I was supposed to cover that back when I taught Node, but I was like, I can't teach this unless we have some chain going on. And a login checker is the perfect example of a middleware, and we just created our own. Now, you could say, hey, why don't you just put the login code right in here? And we totally could, but the issue is there will be other endpoints that we want to secure. So isn't it much easier to just throw login checker there than it is to have to do all this code every time you want to create a new endpoint? So that's why we do it like that. Okay, so we're going to go here. I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to click, am I logged in? Nothing happens, right? So I'm going to go to my network tab, and I'm going to come back here. And what do we see? A bunch of pending things. That means at some point, the server didn't send something back. So what we are going to do is jump back here, and I'm going to open up my server terminal, and holy gamoli, we have a ton of errors. And the first error that we have, right, always go to the first error, not the one at the bottom of the terminal. And it says error, where parameter username has invalid undefined value. Well, what's happening is our Express server is going to add. It's going, great, I know I want to add. Here's your body parser stuff. Let's go figure out login checker. All right, login checker, go find the user where the username that they uploaded is something. Well, let's look at our front end code again. Our front end is only uploading num1 and num2. So we need to tell our front end, hey, send the username and password up when you're trying to add two numbers together. So we are going to say username is equal to this.state.login username. And the password is equal to this.state.login password. Okay, so we're gonna go back to our front end. It's going to refresh on us if it hasn't already. I'm going to say, am I logged in? And I get a 401 on authorized. Great, we're making progress. It's a different error. Okay, what's this error? So the 401 on authorized is saying you can't add these two numbers together. The username and password don't exist. Well, we didn't sign in with a username and password, so good, our code's working, right? Errors aren't always bad. And sometimes you actually want your own code to throw errors. Okay, so we are going to create a username that is CIC, and our password is 123. And we're gonna do the same thing here. And because we have all of our code from last night, bcrypt is gonna run, it's gonna hash the password, it's gonna have a bunch of salt in it. It's gonna think it's at McDonald's, and then it's gonna go into the database, right? So we're gonna create account. We get our user created. I'm going to hit am I logged in, and I still get a 401 because I just created the account. I haven't signed in yet. So I'm going to do my username and my password. I'm going to hit login. I get my user signed in. I know my auth is working. And now we're going to click am I logged in, and I get my 3. Great. Now I want to log out. Okay, well, there's no logout button. And even if I do log out, what's logout going to do? Clear these form fields? And hey, wait a second, I want to log in and then go to another page. I don't want my login form to show up all the time on my website. Okay, so now we got a problem because we want to store that long term. And you know what? Every time they make an API call, we don't want them sending their password up to the server every time. We want to see if they're logged in and go, great, just tell me if you're logged in or not. We don't want to check the password every single API call. Okay, so how do we fix that?
Does React have
State is a temporary data store. So as soon as I go to a different component or go to a different page, state gets clear. So state's kind of a middleman between data coming in and the data showing up in render. And you'll dive into that more with Joey next week. But the best way to think about it now is it's kind of that middleman. It's like, okay, data comes in and I don't want to have to re-render it or trigger my HTML and build it all out like we did in jQuery. So I'm going to get the data in and I'm going to dump it in state, and then I'm going to use state in render, and it's magically going to show up in the interface, which is what's happening when I click this button, right? The 3 shows up. I didn't have to target the ID. I didn't have to do any of that. All I did was update the state, and render automatically showed that for me. Okay, so the problem that we, the way we are going to fix this is with cookies. And what cookies are going to do is they are going to give us a ID that we can just send to the user. And the user is going to have this ID, and they're going to say, hey, my ID is some random string. And our server is going to get that, look up that random string, and have a secure place where we can put in our own user data and define it however we want. And we can trust that that data is secure because the end user has no idea what the random string of another user is. So basically, we can store data in the server that the only thing that can set data into that cookie is the server itself. So the end user can't go, hey, I'm signed in. All the end user can do is say, hey, the server told me ID ABC123. I'm going to tell the server every time I do something ABC123, and our backend code behind the scenes is going to look up ABC123 and go, oh, that means your user blah, 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 and you've already signed in. Okay, that might come together a little bit as we work on the code.
Who has the cookie?
The browser holds the cookie. So the browser holds the cookie, but it's told by the server what the cookie ID is. So the first thing we need to do is tell Express that we're going to be working with cookies, okay? I really should have brought in cookies today. I think I dropped the ball on that. Just give them out whenever someone answers a question. Totally my bad. Okay, so the first thing we are going to do is stop our server in the backend, and we are going to npm install --save cookie-parser. And we, just like we want access to rec.body, we also want access to rec.cookie. And so we are going to install that, and we are going to npm start before I forget to get my server back up and running. I'm going to go up to the top of my index code. I'm just going to comment out the things we aren't using anymore, like MD5 and crypto random string. And it's a good idea to npm uninstall them, just like we npm installed them, because we don't want random packages laying around our server that we're not using in case down the road they become insecure and have vulnerabilities. But just for demo's sake, we are going to const Cookie-Parser, and that is going to require Cookie-Parser. Great. Now we want to tell Express, hey, use Cookie-Parser. Why did I? Oh, I missed it. Okay. Use Cookie-Parser. Now what we are going to do, remember encryption? What's the difference between regular encryption and hashing? Hashing is technically a type of encryption, but hashing is different because think back to the video of, so the thing with hashing is it's one way, right? So once you put in the data, you can't get the data back out. Regular encryption, it goes, hey, I have a piece of data here, and I'm gonna put a lock on top of that. And if you have the right key, we can remove that lock and still see the original data in plain sight, right. But if we take some data, right, and we hash it, there's no way of removing that lock, right? The only way to check to see if you have the right key is to see if the key matches the lock. And if the key matches the lock, you know that this behind it is what actually matched. Okay, so with cookies, we aren't going to hash the cookie because what we want to do is get access. We want to be able to unlock that and see what the user data was. So what we are going to do is in our cookie parser, we're going to put in a top secret password that Max likes. Now, obviously, you should make that something more secure or a random string yourself. What's important is that whatever you type in there stays the same. Because if you change that, you now won't have access to the cookies that all your users have. So the user is going to say, hey, I'm cookie ID ABC123. And what we're going to do is say, okay, ABC123, tell me what ABC123 uses, what ABC123 means if we use top secret password that Max likes. And the cookie's gonna all of a sudden on the server side go, oh, that means user ID 1 is logged in. But if we change top secret password that Max likes and we generate that cookie the first time with top secret password that Max likes, user uploads it, everything's good. Now let's say we instead of putting in a string here, we just use a random generator. Well, now the server's going to reboot, it's going to generate something new, and any new users that log in since the server rebooted are going to be fine and be good to go. But for anyone who logged in before the server generated a new random string, it's going to go, hey, I'm ABC123, do you remember me? And it's going to go up and it's going to try and log in with the new random password that got generated, XYZ. And it's going to go, XYZ, ABC123, I have no idea what you're talking about. So we're going to just use a password here that remains the same even if the server reboots. So we can look at what ABC123 is, put our encryption password in, and figure out that ABC123 actually means that user ID 1 is signed in. Okay. All of that is great in theory, but unless we use some cookies, I think we need to get to baking. Okay, so what we're going to do, I know it's corny. So we're gonna jump down to our login code, and in our login code that we already have written, what we are going to do is, instead of, we still have to check the hash, right? This is the first time they've signed in. They have no cookies. They go to the page. They just want to sign in. So when we go to login, we still need to go to the database and find their username. And they still need to upload the username and password that they say they are. We still need to throw some error if the user is not signed in. If we find them in the database, we still need to compare the password that they uploaded to the hash that we pulled out of the database and compare the two of them. And we still need to say that they can't sign in if that doesn't match. And you know what? We even need to still tell the server that the user is signed in and everything was successful if the password did match. But we're going to get fancy here and we are going to say, hey, send them back a cookie as well. When they log in and we tell them they're logged in, we're going to send them a cookie. And what cookie are we going to send them? Let's just create this new thing called user ID. Because sometimes it's helpful not to know just whether someone is signed in or not. It's helpful to know what user is signed in. And what are we going to shove in user ID? We are going to shove the userdb.id. Okay, well, where's that coming from? That's coming from the database. So we are going to we're going to store some information in the cookie. So all they're going to get back is a cookie ID. And all the browser knows to do is send that cookie up. Whenever it makes another API call, it's going to send that cookie data up. Okay, and what we're going to do is get that ID, go look in our Cookie-Parser, and we're going to pull out all the information that we put in the cookie. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
I'm not really following. Is this like Amazon, but recently, or things you recently looked at stuff?
It's,
Did you give a real world example?
yeah, so when you sign in to somewhere, there's always a checkbox that says, keep me signed in.
Yeah.
That's what cookies are.
Oh, the remember me.
The remember me, yeah. So let's look at how that's implemented, right? This is great in theory, but let's look at what's actually happening here. So we are going to put a console.log here that says sign in successful. Okay, so we're gonna go back here, we're gonna hit our login button and we get user signed in, and we're gonna go to our terminal and we see sign in is successful, right? Nothing's changed, that was working before. But if we go back here and hit login again, we go back to our code and we still have sign in successful, which means we checked the password again. We did all that hashing and the username and the password, and we don't need to do that because we sent them a cookie. So what we are going to do is, before all of our code, before we check the database, before we hash it, before we do all of that, we are going to say, hey, if there is a rec.cookies.userid res.send the message user is already signed in. However, if there is not a res.cookies.userid, then go through the whole login process again. And if they make it through the login process, we're going to add that cookie in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to change our sign in successful to sign in successful, but used a hash. And up here, we are going to console.log sign in successful with cookie. Just so we know, because we don't care whether it was with a hash or whether it was with a cookie, all we care about is knowing which one worked. So we're going to go here, we're going to clear our terminal, and when we hit sign in, we see user signed in. And if we look at our code, we see sign in successful, but use the hash. Okay, well, let's try that again. Let's hit login one more time. We still get user signed in, and we go to our VS code, and it's still using a hash. So we know there's something wrong here, because that second time we signed in, it should have come up here and found the cookie. Exactly. So
Now, how does it know to send?
right here. So we set the cookie before we send it back.
But then that second, what, how does that know?
So by default, whenever you do a fetch, it's going to attach those cookies to send up.
And does that, like, live in your browser or?
Lives in the browser. Well, both. The ID lives in the browser, but the server is going to remember the ID and any information we sent in there. So it's going to get ABC123 that lives in the browser. It's going to upload to the server. The server is going to use Cookie-Parser and go ABC123. Oh, that means user ID is this. And then in our code, we should be able to use rec.cookies and get access to our user ID. However, that's not happening. And that is not happening because no idea why that isn't happening. So we're going to debug live. So what we are going to do is, first of all, let's go to the browser. We're going to go to our network tab. We're going to refresh, clear everything out. I'm going to CIC and type in my username. I'm going to hit login. And we have this first 204 that happens where it's just kind of feeling it out and seeing what's on the server. But the 200, the OK, is what we actually want. So we're going to go to the 200. We're going to look at the post, and we're going to see the request payload, right? Is the CIC username and password. That's all fine. What we are also going to do is scroll up and look at our response, which has user signed in, that's fine, and our headers, log in, and no cookie information in here. Okay. So we're going to go back to our code. We're going to go to the login. And we're going to make sure, first of all, that we have no other login code that's overriding what we were doing before, which we don't. And we are going to console.log rec.cookies. And we're just going to see if any information from the front end is getting sent up to the back end. So we're going to go in here, we're going to clear, we're going to hit login again. We get our 200, but let's look at our server. And we have object null prototype, which says to me that it's not sending the cookie information back up. Okay. So let's make sure that when we log in, it is, no, it's definitely hitting that code. We know it's hitting this code because our console says sign in successful, but use the hash. So my hypothesis right now is that when we do res.cookie, it's not actually setting the user ID to user DB ID. So let's just come down here and console.log user DB.ID to make sure it's coming back from the database correctly. So we'll hit login. we'll go to VS Code, and we see that 13 is coming back. So user ID is coming back. We do have access to that. So there's just an issue with sending the cookie back to the browser.
Where did 13 come from? Like,
13 was generated when we added the new user, when we created the account. So if we
that's
look
user ID.
as the user ID, so if we look in T-SQL and connect in and look in users, the CIC username I created was just generated because we had 12 other user accounts before that. So let's scroll up to where we use Cookie-Parser. We are requiring it. We're going to check in our package.json and make sure it installed. Cookie-Parser is installed. Okay. And app.use Cookie-Parser is using a random string. So that's all right. I'm going to check. I'm just going to add some text and make sure that that's the code that's executing. I have no idea why it wouldn't be though, is it? So we'll go back to our console, we'll log in. It's definitely hitting that code. I'm gonna take a couple-minute break and let everyone catch up to where I'm at before I keep going. got let's see. Now I have audio. Okay. Thank you, Linda, for letting me know. Okay. So what I want to do is for that add function, all I want to do is say, hey, if the user signed in by checking their cookies, that means they're good to go. They can add two numbers together. But if they are not signed in, let's let them know that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here, and in our login checker before, if I can find it, we were doing all the database stuff, right? But we can actually comment all of this out and simplify it radically. And the way we can simplify it is say, hey, if there's a rec.cookies.user_ID, then do the next thing. Go ahead, let them do whatever endpoint they want to access. Else, we want to res.status.401, and we are going to send back something. And what are we going to send back? We are going to send back a message that says no cookies for you. Okay, well, that's great. And our login checker is already using our add endpoint is already using our login checker. Great. So we're going to go back here and refresh the page. I'm going to click am I logged in, and I get error connection refused, failed to fetch. All right, well, let's go back to our code. And what's happening here? Well, I turned off my server. So I just need to npm start it. It's going to fire back up. I'm going to go back to my code. I'm going to refresh. I'm going to say, am I logged in? And now we have another error. Okay, what's that error? Access to fetch at localhost 5000 add from origin localhost 3000. Again, 3000 is our front end and 5000 is our back end. Has been blocked by CORS policy. Response to pre-flight request does not pass access control check. What the hell does that mean? Well, the value of the access control allow origin, okay, we're dealing with CORS here. Header in the response must not be wildcard when the request credentials mode is an include. So all of that is saying is that our backend, we said, forget CORS, allow any CORS response, right? But fetch is like, no. I want to make sure that I am specifically allowed to get the credential information to and from the server using cookies. You're not allowed to just say anyone's allowed to get credentials. You have to specifically say on the server that the front end is allowed to get those cookies. So what we are going to do is we're going to pop up in our backend code to app.useCORS. And what we are going to do is we are going to pass in some information. And what information are we going to pass in? We are going to say, let's go to the documentation that Express has. So I could just Google here. Let me do that from scratch. I'm going to say Express CORS. And I'm going to click on the first link because that's expressjs.com. That must be something good. And I'm going to scroll down here and they're saying, okay, enable all CORS requests, right? App.useCORS. That's what we were doing before, but that's not good enough for fetch. So I'm going to go down a little bit more. And I'm going to look at the configuring CORS. And what configuring CORS does is allows me to pass in an origin. Okay, so it's allowing me to pass in a specific thing, a specific URL that it wants to allow on CORS. So great, I'm going to take that. I'm going to go back to my code and I am going to say the origin, the URL that we want to allow is http://localhost 3000. So the server is now specifically saying, hey, if this is coming from localhost 3000, it's okay to do CORS on that one. So we're going to go back to our code. We're going to refresh. We're going to CIC. We're going to 1, 2, 3. We're going to log in and we get the same error. Okay. Well, apparently I did not do my CORS well enough. Origin and the URL, and that's getting passed in. So I'm going to use my origin as 3000. Okay, and the other thing I'm going to do is totally not cheat because I had this figured out before and then forgot and then remembered again, is we want to do a quick look for credentials, right? Because we were doing credentials on the front end. We were working with the cookie. So what we also need to do is say, hey, when something comes in from cross origin, from a URL on a different port, we want to include those credentials because by default, Express is trying to help us out and be secure. And what we are saying is, no. The credentials are cool. That's fine. Let's pay attention to that. Okay. So we're going to go back here, go to React app. We're going to refresh. We're going to log in and we have users already signed in. Okay. Great, users signed in. We don't have any errors. I'm going to click, am I logged in? And I get 3. Okay, but the whole point of doing this, right, was that we could hit the log out button. We don't have a log out button. So let's add that. What we're going to do is go to our front end code. We are going to, right next to our login button, we are going to put a button color equals danger. On click, this.logout. And we're going to call it logout. Then we're going to go define what our logout is. So we're going to come up to the top. We're going to say logout equals some function. And what are we going to do? We're going to do another call to the server. And we're going to grab all this stuff. And we're going to throw this down here. And we're just going to console.log user is logged out. And we don't really need to send up any body. So we're just going to take all of that code out. We still need to include our credentials, however, right? Because we need to tell the server who we want to log out. So we're still going to leave in credentials include. We are going to, instead of going to add, we are going to log out. Okay, great. Where are we going to log out? What's that going to do on the server? Well, we need to tell the server that, hey, if you get a post request to log out, all you need to do is recres as always. And in our recres, we are going to res.clear cookie. And what cookie are we going to clear? We're going to clear the user ID that we had set. Okay, but whenever we res, we always have to res.send, and we're going to send back a message, user is logged out. All right, we're going to go to our front end, and we get a lovely error. I deleted something I shouldn't have. So I'm going to go to my app.js. I immediately see the red squiggly, so I know something is wrong there. So let's see. I am closing that parenthesis, and then I'm closing this parenthesis, which is ending the fetch. I am opening, I am closing, I am opening, I am closing, and I have too many here. So if I just delete that and save and go back to my front end, okay, we have our login button, our logout button. I'm going to just test to see if I'm logged in, because if we click this, we see 3. So something added together, right? That's good because the cookie remembered us. It doesn't matter if I go back here and I see and 1, 2, 3. When I hit login and go to my VS Code, we deleted the logout, the console log. I should probably keep that. We're going to go to our login function. And cookie, and we're going to make a console log here, sign in successful with cookie. And so what's going to happen, hopefully, is when I go back to my front end and I hit my login button, I see user is already signed in with a cookie, and I know in my console log our sign in was successful with the cookie. So what that's saying is we didn't look in the database for the user. We didn't have to rehash their password. We just pulled the cookie and we went, okay, this cookie's good. They must be signed in. Okay, all of that's there. And I can click my am I logged in and I get my 3 response. So I know I must be signed in. Let's test our sign out. So I'm going to hit log out. I get my users logged out. Great. Now for the ultimate test, I want to see if I still can add something together. So I'm going to click, am I logged in? And what do I see? My 401 unauthorized. And I can click on that again, and I'm going to get a 401 again. But if I click on login, user is signed in. Now, again, I had to do that hashing. The cookie was cleared, right? So I did all the hashing. I made sure that it matches. And if I click, am I logged in? I see my 3 show up. There's a little bit of a hiccup, but we got there, right? And that's important. So when we were trying to figure out what instructors were teaching what week, we had kind of already developed the curriculum before we had assigned teachers to it. And so this week, or this module 11 or whatever week number we're on, was hanging out and had this lovely authentication and authorization title on it. And Jesse asked every instructor and hit up everyone in Doug's network, and no one wanted to teach it. And meanwhile, I was running my mouth in the Slack channel going, super important module, happy to help do the curriculum development on it. And then I get this terrible, terrible message from Jesse that says, you want to teach it? And I'm like, nope, no, I do not. And he went, okay, well, I guess we'll find another topic. And about 5 other instructors went, no, it's super important. Everyone should learn that. And I was like, I don't want to teach it. So this was actually a module I took begrudgingly because I knew it was important, and because I had to learn the hashing and the encryption and why salt was important all by myself and learn how the cookies work. But every time I build an auth system, it doesn't matter how automated it is, it doesn't matter if it just uses Firebase, there's always some stupid thing that comes up, like chords, where you're like, get this to work, like it should all be working. So what the plan is it is 8 o'clock. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to let the last half hour be catching up at this point. I will throw the code in Git. I will clean up this code before office hours tomorrow. If you want to go home and work on this project now, that's completely fine. I will have office hours from 5:30 to 8:30 tomorrow. Please try and send me your questions ahead of time, whether it's in Slack or a Google Doc or however you want to, and I will go over them. Sometime early next week, I will create a video on how to use Firebase and how to use get that working in the front end, how it works in the back end, and get all of that connected together. With that said, your homework due Sunday is getting this working, right? Because the point of this is to show I get auth. I'm understanding it. I know how the hashing is working. So I'm going to I'm going to stop here. I'm going to check in my code. I'll do that on the screen share so everyone can see it. I'm going to go to Git and I'm going to say moved off system over to cookies. Always make a useful commit message. It may seem like a silly requirement until you go through your code and you go, commit 1, commit 2, commit 3, where did my code break, right? So it is important to have your commit messages be meaningful. I'm going to stage all the changes, which means I'm going to tell my commit what files are going to be in it. I'm going to go ahead and commit it. Before I push, I always pull. I want to see if any of you guys made changes to the repo. Once I pull, I can then go ahead and push everything up. So between now and office hours tomorrow, I will have this code commented out, and you guys can ask any questions that you may have tomorrow at 5:30. Does anyone really want to have office hours in person versus remote?
I'm not if it's remote, like I can at least be there in the car.
I mean, I will make it remote even if I come down in person, but if there are more than like 2 or 3 people who want to come and ask questions in person, whether it be about their capstone or about things that we covered this week, I'm also fine coming down to coworks.
Keep it open.
Sure. Yeah, just let me know on Slack by like 5 o'clock tomorrow if you're headed to coworks, and I will head to coworks as well if people are going to be there. Otherwise, I'll be live at 5:30. Please join in the Zoom room, not in the YouTube live stream, just so we can talk 2 ways and ask questions. You don't have to turn on your video, but just so I can hear you guys and have 2-way communication there. I'll also be monitoring Slack. Again, I can answer your questions better if you get them to me ahead of time so I can prep for them. Because that whole thing of us taking a break was totally planned out. You know, I wanted to show the debugging process. Okay, any final questions before I end the stream?
I have one.
Yeah.
So you said a couple of times, like, you can't just take this and put it in your capstone.
You can take a lot of this and put it right into your capstone. The important thing is you understand what's happening.
Okay.
I have a question. So you know when you give it the origin,
Yeah.
right, for course?
Yeah.
Would you make that your like site, like your URL for your website?
Yeah, and it's important not only to get it for whatever your URL is that you're developing on, but also add in the cores of wherever you're going to deploy it. So not just localhost 3000 or 5000, but also http myapp.com. And not just http.myapp.com, but also https myapp.com. I can't, yes,
You can add multiple origins.
yes.
So could you, I guess that wouldn't be a great idea in theory.
You can technically
You
add,
could add like 0.0.0.
so you can add, that's what we did to start, right?
Yeah.
Our, this, instead of all of that code, it was just app.use
Right.
cores,
But
which by default is everything.
Right.
But when we did that, Fetch
doesn't
yelled at
work.
us and was like, no, you can't wildcard everything.
I mean,
So
it's kind of, that seems insecure anyway, right?
yes, and so I can't tell you how many times I have deployed something and it goes up to the staging server right before it goes to production and everything's working great. And then I deploy it again and it just dies. And I'm like, oh my God, I tested all this on staging. Everything was great. Why is this breaking? And I'm like, cores. And I just add in the production URL to cores and bloop, everything's fine.
Okay.
So cores can be a real downer until you get it up and running.
Do you have to, okay, next, do you have to use like any, and can you use like multiple endpoints from your URL or like is the base URL fine?
So what we did here is because we're using app.use, this is going to apply to anything we app.get push.
Got it.
It's going to apply to any endpoint that we create. And because we don't have a slash and something else after it, what matters is the domain, not the
Just the base
URL.
domain,
Correct.
And then it will use it for like any other slash after that
Correct.
if it needs to. Okay. That's good to know. That's all.
Yep.
How do you make it go to another page?
What do you mean go to another
So
in your
after you
React code?
log in,
Yeah, that's a great question for Joey next week.
okay,
React Route, right?
React Router.
Kelly React Route.
cool, okay.
Kelly's teaching a $200 video class.
That's right, I'm sending out a newsletter, everybody can sign up. My YouTube tutorial channel on YouTube.
Not
Get
yet.
ready for it. First lesson's free, next